All right, we're trying this again. I don't know if anybody will still be here to join. There's one person here already. That's great to see. If you join, let me know that you can hear me, because this is an experimental process for me, and I'm clearly not doing a great job of it to start. So if you can hear me, sound off in the comments below and let me know. And hopefully here pretty soon, we'll be talking about some fun stuff. Hey, Harry, can you hear me loud and clear? Thank you, Matthew. That's fantastic news. I apologize for this being kind of a rocky start. This is indeed the Alex Hollings from AirPower. I really appreciate you guys showing up for this, first live in a very long time. I keep intending to do these because I want to interact with you guys more often. I'm constantly shocked by how well-informed and reasonable the audience is on this channel. But I always let myself sort of get sucked into my research, and I focus so much on that I kind of push the deadline for every video. But I thought that it would benefit me, to be honest, to include you guys earlier in the content creation process, because you guys are, again, really well informed and reasonable, and you might even help me identify different tracks that I could sort of pursue. So I'm going to do my best to read these questions in real time, but maybe in the future, I'll rope in one of my assistant editors to read the questions and identify some good ones for us. But for the time being, I'm just going to try to read through the questions that I see pop up, and I'll do my best to give you the best answers that I can. Let's see, greetings from Germany. That's very, very cool. I'll actually be traveling to Germany in just about a month for the NATO Air and Space Power Conference. They invited me to come speak and be on a panel there. So I'll actually be in Germany for the first time in Lord knows probably 10 years here in just about a month. I'm a big fan of your country too. Let's see, Alex, what plane gives you goosebumps and why is it the B-2 Spirit? The B-2 Spirit's definitely on the list. But I got to be honest, it's the F-14 Tomcat. Watching old footage of the F-14, doing carrier launches and carrier landings, it still gives me the same Top Gun goosebumps that it did when I was a kid. Let's see. Can I do any analysis on the new missile bomb that we gave to Ukraine? I think what you're probably talking about is the low-cost cruise missile program that we just told Ukraine we would give them. I think it was something like 3,000 of. Now, this is part of a much broader effort within the U.S. military to field a lot of low-cost cruise missiles. The Air Force alone is looking to fund the production of something like 20,000 low-cost cruise missiles in just the next few years. And there are a lot of different firms sort of competing in this space. Some of the big names, of course, are Lockheed Martin and Anduril, but there are a bunch of others, including those that we'll be sending to Ukraine. Do I think the FAXX contract will be awarded by year end? I could not say for sure, but I'll tell you that I hope so. I personally think that the FAXX program is really important for the future of the American Carrier Strike Group, for the future of American force projection, and for Pacific deterrence. In a lot of ways, you could make a reasonable argument that the FAXX is a more important program than the NGAD effort is, though I could also make arguments to the contrary for that. But I think FAXX is really important, and if I had my way, I would see it funded by the end of this year. Whether or not that will happen, still yet to be determined. Let's see, what are my thoughts on the Gripen E? I love this question. I think the Gripen E is the best bang for your operating buck fourth generation fighter in the world today. I spend a lot of time talking about American aircraft, in part because I have a better understanding of American acquisition processes and the way American aircraft are operated, but also because the United States invests more money into aviation technology than any other nation, right? So when I talk about the F-22 and the F-35, I'm really talking about sort of the Ferraris and the McLarens of the aerospace world. And the Gripen E is sort of like the Nissan GTR. It can stand and swing with a Ferrari or a McLaren. It'll go around the Nürburgring almost just as fast. And if you don't have Ferrari or McLaren money, the Gripen E is an excellent, excellent choice. But, if you do have Ferrari money, the F-35 is your better bet. Let's see. Most bang for your buck, aka for Europors. That's not really the case. I mean, yeah, the European states tend to invest less into defense than the United States does, but it's important to understand that when you're buying a fighter, you're not buying a fighter to compete with other countries' fighters in sort of like a one-on-one cage fight, dogfight sort of competition. You're buying a fighter based on your very unique defensive needs and maybe, what you intend to lend in terms of air power to broader alliances you might be a part of. But your concerns in Estonia aren't necessarily the same as America's concerns in Texas. Alex, I just wanted to say thanks for all the years of epic content. You're one of the best on here for Air Power News. My question, thoughts on the seaworthy cargo plane like a future stealthy C-17? First of all, that means a ton. Genuinely, I am just an airplane nerd who got lucky enough to do this for a living, and I really, really appreciate the support you guys give me. My thoughts on a stealthy cargo plane like a C-17. That's an interesting question. I think that we will eventually see low observable design become commonplace across all military aircraft applications. And then eventually we may even see radar absorbent materials become so cost effective that they can be applied to just about everything, especially with things like ceramic RAM being developed by folks like Cheryl Zhu. But in the meantime, I think it's pretty unlikely that we'll see stealthy cargo aircraft manifest in the near future, just because stealth is immensely expensive and airlift operations aren't normally in really high threat environments. So I think they will probably be one of the last platforms we see adopt stealth. We certainly should see it in tankers sooner. Do I think the E-7 Wedgetail is better than satellites, at least for the time being? I don't think that. I know that objectively, the E-7 Wedgetail is better than satellites for the time being. The Air Force is having trouble paying for all the stuff that the Air Force needs to pay for, but that doesn't change reality. And reality is the E-7 Wedgetail is a current existing capability that we could plug in, whereas the idea of using satellites to replace AWACS is sort of a future possibility that isn't ready to manifest quite yet. Alex, what do you think of the Chinese claims that they crossed the, oh man, I'm going to mispronounce this because I've never read it out loud before, Tsushima Strait undetected, presumably flying a J-20? Is it legit or just more propaganda? I'll be honest, I mean, it could be legit. There are a million variables to consider when it comes to detecting, tracking, and targeting a stealth aircraft. I think it's just as likely that it's true as it is that it isn't. And I think that the information that we could derive from either possibility is fairly minimal without knowing a lot of the other stuff going on at the same time. What radar arrays were even active at the time, if there were any radar arrays active in the local area, or if the closest array was hundreds of miles away, what frequencies those radar arrays were broadcasting on, whether or not the aircraft was flying with external stores, whether or not it had Lunenburg lenses. There's a lot of variables to consider. And so when you hear these rumors about like an aircraft being detected or an aircraft not being detected, more often than not, without a lot of concrete details, you can sort of just dismiss it. Did I catch Justin Bronk's opinion emphasis on drone development being, people are scrolling, being a partial fallacy since Russia will be able to counter them? Thoughts? I didn't catch Justin Bronk's analysis on that. I have read a lot of his work. He's excellent. Do I think that drone development being a partial fallacy since Russia will be able to counter them? I think that a lot of things about drones and modern warfare could be construed as a fallacy or sort of very popular misconceptions. Drone is such a general term at this point. It's a lot like AI in that it's one term that we use as sort of a catch-all for a huge variety of different technologies and systems. Right now, we'll call like a quadcopter you buy at Hobby Lobby and the Kratos Valkyrie both drone. Right? We'll call the RQ-180 a drone as well. And those are sort of three different points on a very wide spectrum. So drones are absolutely the future of warfare in one shape or another. I don't think that FPV drones are the nightmare that they're often made out to be for future conflicts. I think that we'll invest heavily into ways to mitigate them, and eventually they'll be just another threat we need to worry about, like artillery and JDAMs. Let's see. How much faith would I put into the B-21? Oh, sorry, it just refreshed on me. Skip Gen 7, a disclosure will mean alternate propel. Bill Reeves, thanks a lot for that. I think what you're saying is skip Gen 7 as disclosure will mean alternate. I think what you're probably saying is that disclosure of like anti-gravity propulsion systems will be what we see as 7th gen aircraft. And I'm going to take this opportunity to sort of get on my soapbox about fighter generations. You guys probably already know how I feel about this, but fighter generations are, to a large extent, malarkey. They're marketing malarkey. It's stuff that we use to help convey how significant new capabilities are, but it's not necessarily something that we can use as like objective measurements. And that's a big part of why I'm not even sure if we'll see 7th generation fighters ever manifest, except maybe way down the line when we're looking back in hindsight. And the reason for that is that I think 6th generation fighters will really be the first ones to be truly modular, where we'll see a lot of mission systems, a lot of avionic systems sort of carry over from one platform to another. And we'll see platforms themselves more accepting of changes in not just onboard avionics, but maybe even new plane forms, maybe new wings, new tail sections, things like that. Stuff that Lockheed's talking about doing with the F-35, but right now isn't really feasible in terms of cost, could become feasible down the road. And because of that, if you're able to upgrade the systems in your fighter every 2 or 3 years for not a crazy amount of money, well, then when you produce a new fighter airframe, the systems that come with that new fighter airframe will be the most modern available, but they'll probably only be a few years newer than the systems in your legacy airframes at that point. The line between the previous airframe and the new airframe is going to be a lot blurrier. And as such, the line between generations is only going to get blurrier. We've already seen that with a lot of 5th generation capabilities being ported to 4th generation fighters, with talk of turning the F-35 into a 5th generation plus, or 5th and a half generation. The lines get blurrier every day, and that's only going to get worse as time goes on. So I think we'll probably lose sight of these generational designations 1 or 2 fighter airframes from now. What do I think about FCAS failing more or less, with France doing their thing, just like Eurofighter? Is there any way for Germany to get their hands on a 6th gen in the future? I don't think FCAS is failing. I think that it's a troubled program, like all really expensive aviation programs tends to be. I was actually working on a script earlier today about the SR-71 Blackbird, which we sort of all remember as an objective success nowadays, but that wasn't always the case within the people developing it or within the public consciousness. You know, the SR-71 was immensely expensive and tough to get into the air. And because of that, it was retired twice, you know? I mean, so I think we just have a bad habit of looking at the problems that we're seeing or experiencing today and assuming that they're the worst because they're the problems that we are seeing or experiencing. And we don't have that same context for past problems. The example I always give is how recency bias sort of shapes our perceptions, is the idea that the F-35 crashes a lot when it's objectively one of the safest modern aircraft in history. And the F-16, on the other hand, used to be known as the lawn dart because of how frequently it crashed in its first decade of service. And the F-16 is, again, objectively a successful platform. It turns out it's just really hard to make good fighter jets. But when we see the problems happening in real time, we think they're the worst ones that there ever were. In reality, these problems are all pretty standard. And I think that what we're seeing with FCAS is a product of a lack of real operational need for this 6th generation fighter. It is a deterrent platform. And at this point, there's still plenty of political sway as to whether or not you need that deterrent capability. If and when a situation arises where we know for sure we need it, I bet you we'll see these parties all start to play nice. What do I think is the coolest capability or project that almost certainly exists but hasn't been acknowledged? The alleged 100-meter diameter SIGINT sats blow my mind. I mean, my favorite has to be the SR-72. There's a reason why I've covered it so many times on this channel. I've been a fan of the SR-72 concept since I was a kid. And I really do think that Lockheed, well, I don't think, I know for a fact that Lockheed has a classified program that they've invested billions of dollars into over the years. And we all also know that Lockheed really did invest a lot of their own money into the SR-72 program, up to and including ground tests of their turbine-based combined cycle engine that not only incorporated a turbofan followed by a dual-mode ramjet, but based on at least some of the patents that Lockheed has filed, it seems as though they may have been able to find a way to do it without having a physical diverter. Now, if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, if you saw Top Gun Maverick, when the Dark Star, which is a fictional aircraft but was built by the Skunk Works, was transitioning from its normal turbofan jet power to its scramjets to accelerate up past, Mach 2.5, Mach 3, up into the hypersonic Mach 5 plus area, you could literally see the diverter in the intake flap down so that the air was no longer going to the turbofan engine, which notionally was on top, and instead was going to the scramjets, which were positioned on the bottom, at least seemingly in Dark Star. But it does appear as though Lockheed may have come up with a way to, at the very least, not have to use a physical diverter to transition from ramjet functionality to scramjet functionality. Now, a ramjet and a scramjet work in very similar ways. They both work by having air flow into them and using that for compression, but a ramjet needs to slow that incoming air down to subsonic speeds to make it manageable. And usually you do that with a blocking body in the inlet, right? In the case of Hermeus's Chimera engine, that blocking body is their J85 turbojet itself, right? But it looks as though Lockheed has been able to shape their inlet geometry in such a way that maybe if you just change the inlet spikes a bit, you can change where the shock waves actually interact with the air, or the number or severity of the shock waves, to allow that open inlet to slow the incoming air down to subsonic speeds for ramjet functionality. And then you can, again, just sort of adjust that inlet geometry a little bit to move those shock waves again and allow for supersonic air to pass through while functioning as a scramjet. And that could be a huge deal, because the real challenge of a turbine-based combined cycle hypersonic engine is sort of bridging that gap between where turbofans and turbojets work pretty well, up to maybe Mach 2.5 or so, and where scramjets want to start functioning, which is a bit of over Mach 3. So that Mach 2.5 to Mach 3 window there is tough to bridge. And by using variable inlet geometry to make your dual mode scramjet, or ramjet and scramjet, function as either based on airspeed, could be enough to make this work. I went on for a while about that, so let's move on to a new question here. Alex, like your videos a lot, got me into fighter jets. My question is, why are engine companies not concentrating on hybrid ramjet engines for fighter jets? Also, a detailed vid on this, please. Well, that's actually a lot like what I was just talking about. These turbine-based combined cycle engines, or you might call them a hybrid turbofan ramjet or hybrid turbofan scramjet engine, are the future of high-speed propulsion, but not really the future of tactical propulsion, at least for a really long time to come. And that's because the nature of a turbine-based combined cycle engine, of a hybrid engine, is that it's two engines, sort of just shoved together. And that means that while one of those two engines is working, the other one's just dead weight. And that isn't incredibly efficient, and it doesn't really lend itself well to a lot of different tactical or strategic applications. It's really good for maybe spy planes or strike platforms or bombers, but not necessarily for fighters, because you want to use that weight for fuel and payload rather than an engine that's not doing anything until you come in for a landing. Let's see. Hi, Alex. If a nation knew a hypersonic spy plane was coming in at high altitude, could a high-powered directed energy laser weapon track it for long enough to down it? Now, that is a really interesting question. I'm going to take a quick sip here. Yes and no. It depends on how you're trying to down it and how powerful your laser is. The big limitations with using lasers offensively like this are things like thermal blooming and atmospheric dissipation. And both of those are really just ways of saying that when you shoot a laser beam through the atmosphere tends to get in the way. Atmospheric dissipation is sort of like particles and air and water and things like that in the atmosphere that over time can sort of diffuse your laser beam. And then thermal blooming happens when you're pointing a laser beam at one thing. Let's say something headed straight for you. So that laser beam is sort of occupying the same space in the air for an extended period of time. It creates sort of a lensing effect that will make your beam lose track. It'll make your beam less accurate. And these are all big issues for any kind of offensive or defensive laser applications at long range. It's a real part of why lasers are probably not going to be the answer for things like hypersonic or ballistic missile defense for a long time to come, because you would need such an immense amount of power, and we're really nowhere near it yet. The best chance we have against an SR-72 or a missile would be burning through the side of its fuselage, which you couldn't really do if it's headed straight for you, but you could if you were sort of outside, its path. And that is something that U.S. Navy ships will be doing soon. I don't think that we'll see lasers shooting down the SR-72 anytime soon or other hypersonic platforms. I do, however, think that we could see lasers involved in the targeting calculus that you might use to try to bring down a hypersonic platform like that. Let's see. Thank you so much for that. That $20 is huge. That's awesome. I really appreciate it. Knowing that developments usually stay within DARPA-like agencies for years before being revealed, have you been exposed to any whispering that any alternate propulsion systems like anti-gravity are being developed? You guys might notice me closing my wonky left eye to read. Yeah, I'm a pirate, like I always make fun of. I've heard a lot of crazy rumors about DARPA programs over the years, some of them more believable than others. My DMs are open on most platforms, and I get a lot of crazy claims. As far as credible rumors of anti-gravity propulsion, I'm going to be honest. I mean, there are patents that have been filed by the U.S. Navy that certainly sort of fall into this area, but at this point, it still seems to be very theoretical, conceptual science. This isn't practical application science. It's sort of the theoretical groundwork that we would use to one day build toward a practical application somewhere much further down the road, maybe once we've got fusion cracked, so we have much more power to work with. Because right now, the problem with anti-gravity propulsion, aside from figuring out anti-gravity, is the same problem with building an Iron Man suit, like SOCOM's Talos suit that ultimately got canceled. It's that we do not have sort of compact, powerful enough ways to power these sorts of technologies, short of, keeping you plugged into the power grid or having a nuclear reactor strapped to your back at this point. But, Lockheed Martin has a patent for a containerized fusion cell that could literally fit in the fuselage of the F-16. They filed the patent, I want to say 15 years ago. Doesn't mean they have this technology, but it means they have the concept for it. And if we crack the fusion nut, I'm going to be honest, the sky is the limit. It's hard for me to conceptualize what we could do if we cracked fusion, because for the first part, there would be a lot less reason for conflict with near limitless energy. But in terms of the second part, everything about all of the military technology that we use today is all built on this idea of having to carry a bunch of fuel with you to power your ship or your plane or your Humvee. And the idea of not having to do that anymore would represent a fundamental change in the way we approach defense technology, as well as a fundamental change in the way the world works as a whole. Thoughts on China, Taiwan, USA air defenses? I'm concerned that China will first strike all domains, mowing over current defenses. Now, I think it's really important to understand that it is good to look at the threats posed by a nation like China with clear eyes. But it's also important to remember, just like in Russia, for instance, China's leaders, Xi Jinping and the CCP, don't want to have a very expensive, very costly war on their hands. They want to achieve their strategic objectives without having to do all that mess. And that's sort of the same as the United States, right? So the idea that war will break out between the US and China isn't unfounded. It's what will happen if our diplomatic efforts to achieve our strategic aims go way off track and we fail to bring them back. We saw this a lot, I would argue, between Israel and Iran in the past few years leading up to this 12-day war, where we saw both of them sort of exchanging tit-for-tat attacks that I often called kinetic diplomacy. It was where you let someone know where you're going to be striking, and then you strike, and then the damage is relatively minimal, but you can say to your domestic audience that we attacked, And they can say that your attack was mostly nerfed. And then there's no need for further escalation. And we see that same sort of thing play out, with global powers. We saw it repeatedly throughout the Cold War, and we will see it between the United States and China. The risk is where we fail that brinksmanship. The risk is where you have someone call your bluff and you're painted into a corner where you can't not react kinetically. So good diplomacy in the decades to come is vital. I am a big believer in a strong defense apparatus for deterrence, but deterrence only works when you've got effective diplomats who can sort of convey that message. And that is going to be absolutely vital to preventing that conflict. China feels the same way. They don't want a war. If they have to have a war, well, then so be it. But they'd rather just win without one. And so would we. And that worked out in the last Cold War. Let's see. Hi, Alex. Do you think GCAP will really meet the requirements to be a sixth-generation fighter? Can Europe compete with US and China's best tech? It's a great question, especially because what is a sixth-generation fighter? I mean, I could tell you what some generally accepted criteria tend to be. The idea that it would fly with AI-enabled drone wingmen, that it would have improved all-aspect stealth, that it would have improved advanced avionics, maybe even that it would have adaptive cycle engines. And depending on which of those criteria you sort of hold firmly as a requirement to be a sixth-generation fighter, you could say yes or no, especially because it's still in such early stages of development. So at this point, I think there's no reason to believe they can't do it, but I think it's possible that, just like the F-35 when it first emerged, a lot of people argued the F-35 wasn't a real fifth-generation fighter because it couldn't supercruise the way the F-22 could. And at the time, everything the F-22 could do were sort of the requirements to be a fifth-generation fighter. And then we sort of changed the requirements when we fielded better fighters that couldn't do all of those things. So we may yet see the sixth-generation criteria change quite a bit in the years ahead. If I missed the super chat, just add a reply. Did I miss some super chats? I'm sorry, guys. Here's one from Rodney. The technology and societal changes wrought by fusion power could be seismic. I could not agree more, Rodney. I think you hit the nail on the head. Kyle, thoughts on China, Taiwan, USA air defense? We talked about that one. Did I miss anybody else's? If I did, let me know. I really do apologize. This is new to me, so I'm trying to keep up the best that I can. Let's see. Have any recent news on the joint air-to-ground missile? Last I heard, they had done some limited test deployment several years ago, but no news since. The joint air-to-ground missile, the JAGM, is the new Hellfire replacement. And yeah, actually, Lockheed Martin just got, I think it was a $750 million contract for Hellfire and JAGM production, which is going to help sort of expand production on that. And eventually we will see sort of the transition away from the Hellfire line and toward the JAGM line. And I mean, Lockheed is still working on it. I'm going to be totally honest with you. I spoke to a Lockheed engineer about some JAGM developments about a year ago. But then after my conversation with him, Lockheed's press office told me that some of the stuff he told me was classified and I couldn't release. And because I don't know exactly which parts, I'm not going to opine any further on that. Let's see. I missed my super chats and the other chat he started reading and then refreshed. Jeremy, I'm sorry. What's your question, man? Let's see. I see another one from you, so hopefully this is the one. How much faith would I put into the B-21 as a help for the air dominance role? Greetings from Fort Hood. P.S. Could you do an in-depth video on the RB-57? My dad is a huge fan and wanted that. You got it, man. I will put it on my list. And as for the B-21 in the air dominance or air superiority role, well, I could answer that sort of two ways. There's sort of the cop-out way, which is strategic bombers have always been really important for the air superiority mission because strategic bombers can engage airstrips and runways and infrastructure that you need to support ongoing fighter operations. But that's a cop-out because what you're really asking is whether or not the B-21 could potentially fly its own offensive counter-air, could defend itself against adversary tactical aircraft. And in my opinion, technologically speaking, there's no reason why it couldn't, except potentially cost. Every added weapon system to a platform costs a bunch of money in integration hardware, software, and testing. And we're seeing this as a part of the Block 4 upgrade for the F-35. It's adding weapons like the Meteor air-to-air missile for European operators. And every time you add a weapon, it costs a bunch of money and takes a bunch of testing, which costs a bunch of money. So to some extent, you could see limitations on the weapons that are sort of integrated into a platform based on budget, right? So if the B-21 program starts needing to get stingy or cut costs, well, then that would probably be one of the first capabilities to go with the F-47 on the way. We may even see it sort of deprioritized just because the F-47 exists. But in the modern world, it's more software than hardware, keeping you from integrating some of these weapon systems. And if you're building a platform from the ground up, it shouldn't be that difficult to integrate air-to-air missiles, especially under the assumption that the B-21 will be carrying a very advanced active electronically scanned array radar on its own. So the B-21 would basically have all the tools it needs to leverage air-to-air weapons, as well as the ability to control AI-enabled drone wingmen to leverage their own. But whether or not we actually see it happen isn't necessarily a certainty. Let's see. Music's for me. Thanks a lot for the $20. That's awesome. Spock had asked about whether or not you think the Gen 7 could be space capable. My last question is, do you dabble in DCS, Digital Combat Simulator? So whether or not I think Gen 7 fighters or whatever future fighters might be called will be space capable, to be honest, I don't think so, at least not anytime soon. And that's in large part because there's a ton of sky in between where the highest flying fighters operate today and what we generally consider to be space, right? And then there's even more sky between that and low Earth orbit. And there's not a lot of practical use cases for operating in a lot of that sky. The reason why the F-22 Raptor has thrust vector control isn't to do rad maneuvers at air shows, even though that is awesome. It's mostly for things like nose authority while flying at altitudes above 65,000 feet, even though, the Air Force just says its max ceiling is above 50,000 feet. We know the F-22 can fly a lot higher. It was flying higher than 60,000 feet when it shot down that Chinese spy balloon a few years ago. But when you're flying that high, even the huge control surfaces on the Raptor, and they are huge, the tail horizontal control surface on the Raptor is about as big as the F-16's wing. I mean, huge. But even with control surfaces that big, at those really high altitudes, the air is too thin to really allow for dynamic maneuverability. And that's why that thrust vector control comes in handy, because you aim the thrust down, it'll aim your nose like that, and that allows you to sort of point that powerful AN/APG-71 V2 radar at the bad guys that are all but certainly flying at a lower altitude than you, which was even more important for the Raptor up till this upgrade because it lacked helmet cue targeting, and you really needed to point the HUD of the Raptor at your opponent to be able to shoot at them. Let's see. Do I think the F-302 is real? I'll be honest. I've never even heard of the F-302, so no. But if somebody can educate me, I'd appreciate it. Do I think there's been a production run, not one-off, of unacknowledged crewed stealth ISR aircraft, not capable of supersonic, just dedicated stealth spy platforms like the U-2? Yeah, I mean, there's proof. The RQ-170 started flying in operational service back in 2007, but wasn't sort of revealed to the world until 2009 when people started snapping pictures of it over Kandahar. That's how it got the name, the Beast of Kandahar. Since then, we've learned that it was Lockheed's RQ-170 Sentinel. But the RQ-180, which is an even bigger flying wing stealth ISR aircraft, is so secretive still that I don't know if it's actually called the RQ-180. That's just what we call it. And to be honest, I think the RQ-180 is a really big part of why Northrop Grumman has had so much success with the B-21 Raider, because a lot of the plane form of the B-21 Raider seems to be awfully similar to the RQ-180, meaning we sort of already went through a whole test revolution of test article aircraft with the RQ-180, and then we just sort of turn that into a crewed platform that could also drop bombs in the B-21. That's just my theory. Let's see. Alex, what do you think of the Army's decision to mount miniguns on some of the Abrams instead of the M250 cal? Wouldn't this make it harder for armored divisions to deal with APCs and IFVs? I think it's important to remember that all the Army did was test the idea. The Army hasn't said, we're putting miniguns on the Abrams. The Army said, let's see how miniguns work on the Abrams. And it did look, as far as I understand, to perform pretty well on the table of firing drills that they were doing in that exercise. But I also know a lot of tankers do not like the idea at all. And like all things, I think the answer might fall somewhere in between, but I think it's pretty unlikely that we see miniguns fielded en masse on the Abrams, but I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. Let's see. Opinion on the U.S. Marine Force 2030 plan. It's near and dear to my heart, man. As a Marine veteran, I pay pretty close attention to the developments of Marine Corps warfighting strategy and doctrine and how it's sort of changing from my time in. It's been 10 years or more, maybe, since I was in, through today, especially with concerns about the Pacific in mind. And I think that the Marine Corps 2030 plan makes a lot of good changes in the right direction to be a sort of lightweight, quick response force. I don't think it's perfect. I could nitpick, I could find things that I take issue with, but I also think that as these plans manifest over time, we're also going to see the plans sort of shifting under the weight of reality, which I think will sort of round off some of the edges of my harsher criticisms. I acknowledge that's a bit of a cop-out answer. I apologize. I love the Marine Corps. It's hard for me to speak ill. Let's see. What was the flying wing that Iran took down a few years ago? That was an RQ-170, as a matter of fact. And it looks as though Iran has had a lot of success with reverse engineering, at least the plane form of the aircraft. But again, it is important to understand the RQ-170 started operating in 2007. That means its design work was probably completed in the very early 2000s. It is a quarter-century old piece of technology at this point. That doesn't mean that it's useless. It doesn't mean that Iran can't get anything valuable from it. But I also think it's important to know that there is a big difference between building something that looks like the RQ-170 and building something that operates like one. We have all seen videos of people making Lamborghinis out of, plywood, and then they're being powered by pedals, but with a good coat of paint, you can kind of make it convincing. They've been building kit cars of, Ferraris out of Fieros my whole life. And you can do the same thing with aircraft. So yeah, Iran did get their hands on an RQ-170, and nope, I'm not all that particularly worried about it. More concerned with China getting their hands on it, which seems certain. Let's see. Alex, do I still think Sikorsky's X-2 helicopter tech will eventually sell? It's a fair question. I think that the helicopter industry as a whole is sort of in a transitional period right now because there are a lot of traditional helicopter roles that are being absorbed by a wide variety of UAS or drone systems of varying sizes, shapes, and capacities. And I'm not sure how it's all going to shake out quite yet. I think that there is a future for a lot of types of rotorcraft in combat applications. I'm not sure how many of those rotorcraft are going to be crewed anymore. I mean, last year I was in DC talking to the folks at Lockheed Martin, and they had a tablet in their hand. And using that tablet, they let me control a UH-60 Blackhawk, one of the, I think the only fly-by-wire Blackhawk in existence that was flying elsewhere over Virginia. And I was able to tell it to go hover over there instead of over here by touching a point on a tablet. And that is an aircraft that was already in service that we just retrofitted with new control systems to be able to minimize the risk to human operators. And because of the risk inherent to the way helicopters operate in combat, I think it's likely that we see fewer and fewer of them with pilots on board. But again, that's one of those things where predicting the future of warfare is hard. Maybe I'm wrong, man. Maybe we're going to find out that having a pilot on board is the only way to really effectively operate a rotorcraft in combat. I'm just not convinced of that yet. Let's see. Could it be they cut funds to NGAD to fund the B-21 in an air defense role? I don't think we'd see it for two reasons. The first one being that the NGAD, the F-47 program, is a really important program for the Air Force. At the end of the day, the Air Force's job is to dominate the airspace. All the other stuff the Air Force does is important. But in terms of the way America goes about fighting wars, it needs the Air Force to secure the high ground. None of the other, the F-35s operated by the Navy, the F-35s operated by the Marine Corps, those pilots do train for air-to-air combat, but their goal in their training is not necessarily to secure air superiority, or at least not to do it in a broad sense. They might want to secure it locally over an objective, for instance. Or, you might want to protect the airspace around a carrier strike group. The Air Force's job is to secure air superiority, so the F-47 is important to it being able to do that. But it's also important not to discount the role of prestige in these programs. The F-47 is an immensely expensive program, and one of the reasons why we're willing to fund it is because it is important to America in terms of deterrence, in terms of narrative management, in terms of domestic politics to a large extent, that we can say that we're the top dog in the sky. And with China fielding a wide variety of stealth platforms in testing right now, I've got my own theories about that. It's important that the US asserts its ongoing dominance in the sky. And that's not just about actual capabilities, it's also very much about perceived capabilities and that prestige factor. So I don't think that we're going to see the F-47 compromised in any way for the B-21 in particular. Justin, thanks a lot for the $5, man. I want to be clear. Thank you to everybody for your questions and for chiming in. I just want to make sure I thank the people who threw a few bucks in particular, because I know how far a few bucks goes. So a Taiwanese invasion would be an amphibious landing assault, urban and mountain warfare. That's a big ask for China, in my opinion. Any thoughts? I think you're 100% right. And you even left out one of the bigger challenges China would face prior to that amphibious assault, which would be massing their troops. China has a massive military footprint, and they have a lot of really advanced military technology sort of distributed throughout their defense apparatus. But the level of technological advancement as a whole throughout that defense apparatus is not nearly as high as most people tend to think. Up until not long ago, you would still find horses participating to some extent in Chinese logistical efforts. All right. Nowadays, China relies a great deal on its civilian railways for things like relocating troops and relocating military hardware to a much greater extent than a nation like the United States that could feasibly, do an airlift to, let's say, a country on the other side of the planet overnight and deposit a sizable fighting force. China lacks that logistical capability, and that means that it would take a fair bit of time, and it would be relatively conspicuous to mass China's forces on the shore prior to mounting that amphibious assault, which would in turn, give the United States and Taiwan pretty advanced notice of this amphibious invasion beginning. And at that point, that would sort of spark a lot of contingency plans that have been made and remade and made over again over the past few years. And the most modern ones maybe building largely around weapons like the LRASM, the AGM-158C, long-range anti-ship missile, and platforms like Rapid Dragon even, so that you could very quickly sort of engage a large number of Chinese amphibious assault ships, for instance, and really sort of cripple their ability to cross that 100 to 110 mile strait. So it would be very difficult for China to take Taiwan. That doesn't mean they can't, but it would need to be worth the cost in terms of equipment and lives and sort of political power within China to do it. And it hasn't been more valuable than the cost to date. That ratio may change in the years ahead. So our goal is to try to stay ahead of that, right? Let's see. Is A-10 not viable when the Su-25? Why? You're probably asking, why is the A-10 not viable for Ukraine when the Su-25 still sees combat use in Ukraine? Or why is the A-10 not viable in general moving forward, right? So I think the problem with discourse surrounding the A-10, my own included, is that on the internet, we talk in terms of black and white or upvote and downvote. And so we say the A-10 just isn't survivable in modern contested airspace. And that's why we need to divest those airframes to invest into more modern ones that are survivable. And that sounds like we're saying you couldn't use the A-10 for anything in a modern fight. And that isn't the case. The A-10, like lots of other platforms, like the Frogfoot, could still have a viable role in a modern conflict. It just wouldn't provide as much value to us as it would cost to maintain the operations of the A-10 fleet, to train the A-10 pilots and maintainers and techs, and to maintain the logistical supply for this aircraft that's only capable of doing one thing and is very vulnerable to a wide variety of threats from elsewhere. So, it costs like $1.1 billion a year to maintain the A-10 fleet, and that $1.1 billion a year could potentially be invested into maintaining a different aircraft that could do close air support and something else. Or that money could be invested into adding capability to other platforms that are in service and are much more survivable. So it's not that the A-10 is worthless. The A-10 is a great platform. It's just that the A-10 is getting old. And when your car gets really old, it eventually becomes more expensive to keep it running than it's sort of worth. It becomes time to buy a new car, and it's time to buy something instead of the A-10. I hope that answers your question. Let's see. I get so angry, everyone defending the A-10. The A-10 sucks. The A-10 doesn't suck. The A-10 just has a very specialized purpose. It's sort of like, an offensive lineman, right? If you're an offensive lineman, you're good for one thing. And if a team is recruiting for running backs and wide receivers, then your skill set isn't all that valuable to them. And it just so happens that modern warfare is leaning more toward quarterbacks, running backs, and wide receivers than it is towards offensive linemen, right? Let's see. Wouldn't the soon-to-be retired A-10 be a valuable asset against the Mexican cartels? Again, this is sort of the same question, right? It's like, couldn't we find a good use for the A-10? Absolutely. The A-10 would probably be a pretty capable asset against something like Mexican cartels. But again, we have to ask ourselves, is that worth the $1 billion a year we're going to pay to keep them around just in case we want them to mow down some Mexican technicals? Or would it make more sense for us to, again, invest that money into other capabilities that could feasibly do that if it needed to, but could also do something else when we needed to do something else? Because I don't foresee there being a lot of combat operations against Mexican cartels in the not too distant future. And if there are, I don't think we're necessarily going to be needing to really lean into the heavy firepower. Let's see. An A-10 can't stay on station. Well, I mean, it can stay on station longer than some other platforms. But yeah, no aircraft can stay around forever. The F-47, do I think it'll get a gun? Probably not, I'll be honest. The F-47, if it does manifest in a way a lot of the renders have sort of suggested, is really going to lean hard into all-aspect stealth. And all-aspect stealth will probably mean, if not eliminating those standing vertical control surfaces, at the very least reducing them, right? Likewise, depending on some of the renders we've seen for FAXX, for instance, Northrop's FAXX render showed its air inlets on the top of the aircraft rather than on the bottom. And that makes it a lot harder to do things like fly at a high angle of attack in a close quarters fight and things like that. So I think leaning into all aspect stealth is leaning away from the idea that you're going to be within 4,000 feet of an adversary to engage them. Whether or not we'll end up seeing potted guns or a gun in the FAXX or maybe even one in the F-47, it's potentially possible. But it's also worth noting that the F-35's gun has not seen a whole lot of use, the F-35A being the only platform with an internal 25 millimeter, I think it's the GAU-13 Avenger, the GAU-13 rotary cannon. Regardless, we don't see a whole lot of use out of fighter cannons, and I think we're going to see even less. That doesn't mean dogfighting is over. There will always be squeakers, people who get through sort of that frontline air defense, aircraft that make it through because of sheer numbers. And at that point, aerobatic performance is going to matter. I'm just, when you have the AIM-9X that can pull 60G maneuvers, that can hit a fighter that's behind you, there's less need for me to have a cannon, Let's see. Does the U.S. have enough advanced chip manufacturing capabilities to keep the war machine going if China were to invade Taiwan? I got to be honest with you on this one. I am not as schooled up on this as I should be, but my very surface level understanding is currently no. But there are several efforts underway to sort of try to resolve that. Likewise, the United States couldn't really continue manufacturing high-end defense weapon systems without things like rare earth minerals from China. But on the other hand, a lot of the infrastructure required for refining those rare earths and things like gallium and stuff like that tends to be in the West. So China ships theirs to the United States or to Europe to be refined and processed, and then that gets shipped back to China. So to some extent, China and the United States are sort of interdependent when it comes to fielding advanced technologies. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It could be one of the things that helps us deter a conflict in the future. Tord, thanks a lot. Oh my God. Thank you so much, Tord. I appreciate that. Hi, Alex. Just wanted to thank you for the amazing content you provide. Do you have any thoughts on lower cost air defense systems like NASAMS? Got to see it in operation recently. Really cool. Greetings from Norway. Thank you so much. And Norway is an amazing and beautiful country. I think to answer your question in a much more sort of broad way, we are in the midst of sort of an air defense revolution. And while I do not think that the golden dome, concept could feasibly manifest in the way it's been sort of advertised, I think it will ultimately suffer the same fate as the SDI initiative, the Star Wars program, which is, it's a really lofty goal. We're not going to get to it, but we are going to field a bunch of pretty important technology along the way that, even though we remember the program as failing, a lot of the technology that we built in it has come to be absolutely vital for American defense, even for European defense to a large extent. And I think we'll see the same thing from Golden Dome and from huge investments all around the world. Israeli defenses have really focused a lot on closer range air defense assets like the Iron Dome and the Iron Beam for things like rockets and artillery, and obviously increasingly FPV drones. We're seeing all kinds of kinetic and directed energy systems being developed for low-cost drones and similar weapons. And simultaneously, we're seeing a huge investment into kamikaze drones, which are really low-cost cruise missiles, and then true low-cost cruise missiles all around the world, which is only going to further the need for deep magazine depth in intercepting systems, right? So the more of that we see, the more targets there are in the sky, the more important it is to defend against those targets, the more low-cost air defense systems are going to manifest. And it's going to come in a lot of different forms, and it's going to make it really tough, I would contend, for drone manufacturers and drone operators in the not-too-distant future, as scary as drones are for us today. What are your thoughts on the U.S. focusing on missile interceptors in the Middle East, Ukraine, and Asia Pacific? Is Patriots PAC-3 and SF missile production fast enough? It's not. It's not fast enough. The United States has long sort of operated under the assumption that the conflicts it's going to have to be embroiled in are going to be regional, because they have been since 1991. Right? In 1991, the Soviet Union fell. It wasn't until around 2012 that Xi Jinping really rose to power, and around that time started really modernizing the Chinese military. And that gave us sort of 11-year window without any real near peers to worry about. And during that time, a lot of short-sighted lawmakers were really excited about a peace dividend under the assumption that we would never have a near peer again, which is beautiful wishful thinking, right? But then the global war on terror sort of stretched that out for another 20 years. From 2001 to, let's say, 2021, we needed to funnel a lot of our budget, a lot of the defense budget, into operations and two different combat theaters. And as a result, we sort of stopped investing in things like air defense, which we didn't need against the Taliban or Al-Qaeda, right? But now that's changing again. We are a few years now into the pivot back toward great power competition, and a big part of that pivot has been investing into the industrial and manufacturing base of the United States in places like missile production. We're seeing it right now in real time with cruise missiles. They're being a real priority in terms of sort of infrastructure expansion. The JAGM line as a great example. We're also seeing it with a lot of drone programs, and we are slowly but surely seeing it in interceptors like the SM-3, and certainly the SM-6 needs to be built in much higher numbers. The problem is they're really expensive weapons. So expanding the infrastructure is also really expensive, and that tends to make them sort of the last levers that get pulled, because people want to be able to show as much progress as they can on their next campaign ad or in their next fit rep. Let's see. Do you think both European sixth-generation fighter programs will come to fruition? That's a great question. I think there's no reason to assume that they won't, but things can change. And until we actually see these aircraft getting pumped out of a production line, there are no guarantees. But I think what we'll really see is we'll see, Tempest, FCAS sort of manifest first. And depending on how that goes, could have some impact on how important and how dire the need is for GCAP. Let's see. How far behind is China in the RDE domain? Do we have a comfortable lead? Do you mean rotating detonation engines by any chance? I'm not sure. Maybe I've just got propulsion systems on the brain. To be honest, I'm not sure how they stand in terms of rotating detonation combustion engines as opposed to our most advanced efforts. GE is certainly leading the charge and trying to incorporate it into their dual mode scramjet, which could make hypersonic aviation a much more realistic thing for a wider variety of aircraft in the future. But I'd have to do some reading to know how I feel about where the United States and Chinese capabilities stand. Alex, thoughts on what's causing the delays in the new Columbia-class submarine? Man, oh man, oh man. Yeah, I got a lot of thoughts on what's causing the delays on the Columbia-class submarine. A lot of them have to do with, to be honest, a lack of competition within the industrial base. Something like 70 to 80% of the components in the Columbia-class submarine are single-source components, meaning there's only one vendor who can provide them. And that isn't good for manufacturing anything. The American industrial base, particularly the shipbuilding industrial base, has really atrophied badly in recent decades. And there's really no way to fix it short of just like dumping piles and piles of money into it, because there is no short-term inexpensive fix for a huge and very expensive problem. We keep trying to find short-term inexpensive fixes because a big expensive one would be politically unpopular. But eventually, if you dig a hole that's deep enough, you need to acknowledge that it's time to stop digging. Do I think the USA will sell the F-47 to any other countries? It's possible. I think it depends on a lot of variables that are tough to speak to until we know the actual capability set of the F-47, right? And the technologies that are sort of brought to bear within. The F-22 is often talked about like it's so good that it's still illegal to sell it to other countries. That's not why we don't sell the F-22 to other countries. We don't sell the F-22 to other countries because there aren't any to sell. We only built 195 of them. There was only 150 or so that were ever considered combat coded and fully operational, maybe 160. And because of that, we would never part with one to sell it to Japan. So there was no need to change the law that was actually passed before the F-22 entered service back in the mid-90s when stealth was still a groundbreaking new technology. It isn't a groundbreaking new technology anymore. And that's why the F-35 is sold to every partner nation across the globe. I think it's feasible that we see the F-47 sold to partners, but if the technology found within is sufficiently advanced, we might not see it sold to partner nations in the early days, or we might not see it sold to partner nations at all. I'm going to answer, let's see, 3 or 4 more questions here, because I meant to jump off at 5, but I'm having a great time, and I'm glad you guys are too. So let's see if we can go through a few more questions. Do I have any plans to get a batleth in the future? I mean, if I can afford it, but you may be aware that not long ago, I had this absolutely incredible real Dak Tang made, which is, my prized possession. It's got the House of Gowron seal there. This is like the only stupid thing that I've bought like with social media money. My wife was very cool about me having this custom made, but yeah, I'll get a batleth one day. I'll just have to be, a lot richer, probably, based on how much the knife cost me. Let's see. Second Taylor Hease's question, when will we see the F-47 for real? It's a really good question. I think that there's a solid chance that we see more realistic renders of it within the next year or two. I think that we will all but certainly see the fighter itself, or, the first sort of serial production prototype unveiled in a big flashy demonstration when it does manifest, which might take 2 years. So when are we really going to get to see it? I think that there's a solid chance that we really get to see it right around the next presidential election. And the reason why I say that is because there is a long and storied history of presidential campaigns leaning on high-end new defense programs to sort of help bolster their side. So, for instance, right now, the Republicans are in power in the executive branch. So the Republicans may not be putting up the same candidate, but they're certainly going to want to advance the idea that you'll get more of the same sort of administration. And look at this awesome new fighter that this administration brought to you. We saw Jimmy Carter do the same thing way back in the late 70s when his Secretary of Defense actually revealed the F-117 was in development years before it even secretly went into service. It ended up being a big scandal, and it was all just because the Carter administration was accused of being soft on defense. You know, we've seen it over and over again, politics trumping strategy, and I think we'll probably see it again this next presidential election, where even if the aircraft isn't ready, it'll be made ready because of the political value that it has. Do I think that there are any forward deployed fighters right now, sorry, it scrolled down, armed with the AIM-260 in the Pacific, or is it too early? It's not impossible. It isn't at all impossible. And the reason why I say that is because we know that the AIM-260 has gone through pretty significant testing, including live fire testing in the past few years. It certainly is at a point, I would assume, especially considering it's gone into production, that it could be carried in an operational environment. I do not think it is being carried in an operational environment, but there could be some in theater, just in case something significant were to jump off. It depends on how mature the system actually is. Totally possible. Thanks a lot, Mick. I really appreciate that. Bro, just admit a privatized military-industrial complex is a scam. I mean, if you heard me talking about the problems with single source vendors, those are the same problems with a government-owned military-industrial complex, because the government becomes the single source vendor, and then there's no incentive to become efficient or to reduce costs. So a private military-industrial complex is certainly an imperfect solution, but it is the better option of the two. Let's see. Yes, I try to avoid politics. You guys know this about me. I think that it's important that whoever you vote for, I don't care who you vote for. I want you to be able to come here and learn about how stuff works. And that's what's really important to me, is that you leaving just a little bit better informed than you might have been before. Not because I'm smarter than you, but because I get to research this stuff all day for my job. And if I were to go to your job, you'd blow my mind with the stuff that you know too. So my goal here is to just convey the information that I have the best that I can without sort of turning it into something about politics. So I understand the inclination to get political, but I'd ask that you just sort of be cool with everybody in the chat. Let's see. Do you think Space Force is going to utilize SpaceX's Starship? And what do you think that looks like? I actually have a video I put up maybe a year ago about how Starship could be a huge boon for the U.S. military as a logistical asset for heavy lift, moving cargo and ordnance from one part of the planet to the other on a very, very short timeline when it's important to get things someplace very quickly. It is, however, early days for Starship, and we'll sort of see how it ultimately manifests and what the cost sort of equation looks like, whether or not the return on investment would be there to operationalize it versus contracting it versus not using it at all. Do I think we'll see something with optic camouflage on the B-21? It seemed as if one of the videos showed something like it. No, I don't think so. And the real reason for that is that there isn't a ton of value in optical camouflage for a high-flying strategic asset. You're not going to be able to target the B-21, even if you're looking at it with the naked eye, or at least it'll be very, very difficult to do. So it's not all that important to have, sort of Predator-style active camouflage. I would be more concerned with things like mitigating its infrared signature more effectively than I would be with mitigating its visual signature. Okay, but ignoring questions that are important to national defense is part of what you should be doing. Whether or not Russia got your best stealth fighter's radar signature is incredibly important. I'm not sure where you were getting at with that, but it's also important to understand that just detecting a stealth aircraft with your radar is not necessarily gathering a fountain of information about that aircraft's radar return. Your radar cross-section varies depending on angle of observation and the frequency of the radar array that you're using. It varies depending on the angle of presentation of the aircraft. That's sort of the same as observation, right? And then there are lots of other mitigating factors like electronic warfare and things like that. So just because, the Russian government might have tracked an F-35 flyby, not the end of the world. But if that happened to be in relation to something like, Turkey buying the S-400, well, then, yeah, I would consider that to be a pretty legitimate risk to national security. I wouldn't give them the F-35 either. Let's see. No such thing as stupid questions, only stupid people that ask stupid questions. I don't think there's such thing as stupid questions in this space because most people don't live in this space. You know what I mean? So, there's lots of stuff people don't know. And some of us are sort of deeper into it than others. So something might seem like a elementary or 101 level question to us, but 5 years ago might have been a tough one for me, Let's see here. That's what I wanted. The F-22 or the F-35 wouldn't be showing their true stealth. I think you guys might still be arguing about whether or not Russia got a chance to sort of measure the F-35's radar return. But we got one here on the FAM program. The FAM program is that low-cost cruise missile effort that I brought up earlier in this stream. It's this idea of not just cruise missiles, but right now that's the focus, fielding a huge volume of lower capability, lower cost cruise missiles that can be employed in similar capacities to our really expensive high-end cruise missiles like the JAGM line. The AGM-158B JAGM ER is probably one of the best cruise missiles in the world, and its sister, the LRASM, is probably one of the best anti-ship weapons in the world. But they both cost, 7-digit prices. The LRASM is more than $6 million. The JAGM ER is a bit more than one. That isn't realistic to, deploy in thousands, right? Not in a single conflict in a short span of time. So by fielding really cheap cruise missiles that have a similar form factor and even a similar range, but a smaller payload and maybe less onboard intelligence can make it possible to flood enemy airspace with targets, including those low-cost cruise missiles like Lockheed Martin's Comet or the Barracuda 500 from Anduril, as well as decoys like the ADM-160 Mauled J, which can broadcast the radar return of any aircraft it wants, and the J can also jam enemy radar arrays. So you sort of launch, let's say via Rapid Dragon pallets, a flood of really cheap Comets and Barracuda 500s. You got a bunch of ADM 160s that are pretending to be B-52s and F-15E Strike Eagles. And then you have a bunch of JAGM ERs and a bunch of LRASMs sort of mixed in within all of those. And it really increases the chances that your JAGMs and the LRASMs are going to get through because they're a much smaller radar return than maybe the Comet or the Barracuda. And it also overwhelms adversary air defenses really quickly. They're going to expend a lot of interceptors trying to bring down all these weapons. They're going to focus a lot of them on those ADM 160s that they have to assume could be real bombers or aircraft. And by doing that, you sort of create the opportunity for those higher end systems to work even more effectively. And that is sort of the idea behind FAM. That's the sort of question I had too. Where is technology in detecting stealth? With these Chinese platforms, I have to wonder, you definitely want to be aware of the things coming if you could. Great question. And it's a tough one to answer, in part because detecting and targeting stealth aircraft is obviously sort of a trade secret. If the United States had developed a way to really effectively detect and target stealth aircraft at, operational ranges, they wouldn't necessarily want to even tell people that they did, because as soon as it's clear that there is a way, well, that incentivizes people to look for it. And through things like, accounting and logistics, it's not as hard as people might think to start to determine what types of technologies and what types of systems and what types of engineers, what types of expertise are being devoted to different programs. This is a big part of what intelligence collection is for every nation, right? And so the United States certainly has and does experiment with ways to detect and target stealth aircraft. And that's sort of how the US manages to stay a bit ahead in fielding its own stealth aircraft, because it does things like a lot of folks don't know. Back in 1994, the US just straight up bought an S-300 from Belarus and then brought it to the United States. And then we had that technology to test against our different stealth platforms and things like that. That is a big part of sort of foreign material exploitation, which is, again, a big important part of sort of intelligence collection as a whole. So, does the US have the means to detect and target stealth aircraft? Well, everybody does to an extent, because in reality, targeting a stealth aircraft is just a question of distance. If it's close enough, you can target it. So, can the US potentially target stealth aircraft from further away than other nations can? There's reason to suspect that it could. It's especially worth noting that infrared search and track targeting systems are now more integrated with targeting arrays, radar arrays, than ever, and other sensors at that. So it's not just about having one system sort of being able to pick up on it. If there's a very small radar return, but you can also see it on IRST, that fused data will make it that much easier to target your aircraft. And the IRST systems that are publicly disclosed today are already on the verge of beyond visual range. I mean, so as time goes on, it's going to be easier and easier to detect and target stealth aircraft too, and that's just sort of the nature of the game. Then stealth will have to evolve as well. So, we got one more. I'm going to answer this one more question here from Memedy, I think, and then I think I'm going to call it a night. This has been a blast. I will start doing this more often. Let me know if you guys appreciated this, if this was a good time for you, or what you think I could improve. I wanted to thank you for answering my questions, Alex. What do you think of ground-launched APKWS being given to Ukraine for drone swarm defense? I think that it's a very effective weapon system. You can't see mine, but it's up on the wall there. It's a very effective weapon system for drone defense, as long as we're talking about the right drones. It's a great option for instance, engaging a Shahed 136 or a Russian Garin 2, as long as you're within range. It's not a particularly long range, maybe 3 miles, right? But it wouldn't be a good choice for engaging FPV drones, quadcopter drones, things like that. The cost, benefit analysis doesn't stack up for that. You'd use different defenses for smaller FPV drones. But yeah, the APKWS-2 is a great option for engaging Group 3 UAS systems or bigger drones like the Shahed 136. So I think I'm going to call it a day, guys. This was honestly a lot of fun. I really enjoyed doing this. I hope that you guys got something out of it too. If you want to hit me up on social media, I'm pretty active on my Twitter and my TikTok. Let me know how this went, or feel free to just leave a comment on this. I try to read all the comments on all the YouTube videos, even though I don't necessarily engage with all of them. I really do try to read through them all. So thank you guys. This was a blast. I had a great time, and we'll do it again next Wednesday. What do you say? 4 o'clock next Wednesday. We'll try this again and see if I can get the microphone right from the start. Thanks a lot, guys.